conversational gift, but his gymnastic acquirements were of the first order. Mildred not only could not catch him, but she could not restrain the mannikin from meanwhile doing all kinds of desultory mischief. For in the midst of his course he would pause to overturn her tin kitchen, or shy a plate across the room, or give a vicious twitch to the lovely golden hair of Blondella, in spite of, perhaps in consequence of, his recent tender advances. It was plain that in eluding Mildred he was prompted by caprice rather than by fear. "If things go on in this way," she reflected, "I shan't have anything left. If I could only get the dreadful little creature into a corner! There goes my tureen! What shall I do?" To quit the room, even for a moment, in order to call for assistance at the head of the staircase, where, moreover, her voice was not likely to reach anyone, was to leave everything at the mercy of that small demon. Mildred was out of breath with running, and ready to burst into tears with exasperation, when a different mode of procedure suggested itself to her. She would make believe that she was no longer angry, and possibly she could accomplish by cunning what she had failed to compass by violence. She would consent, at least seem to consent, to let him marry Blondella, though he had lately given no signs of very fervid attachment. Beyond this Mildred had no definite scheme, when the story of the fisherman and the evil Afrite flashed upon her memory from the pages of the Arabian Nights. Her dilemma was exactly that of the unlucky fisherman, and her line of action should be the same, with such modifications as the exigencies might demand. As in his case, too, there was no time to be lost. An expression of ineffable benevolence and serenity instantly overspread the features of Miss Wentworth. She leaned against the wardrobe and regarded Jumping Jack with a look of gentle reproach. "I thought you were going to be interesting," she remarked softly. "Ain't I interesting?" asked the Goblin with a touch of pardonable sensitiveness. "No," said Mildred candidly, "you are not. Perhaps you try to be. That's something, to be sure, though it's not everything. Oh, I don't want to touch you," she went on with an indifferent toss of her curls. "How old are you?" "Ever so old and ever so young." "Truly? How very odd to be both at once. Can you read?" "Never tried." "I'm afraid your parents didn't bring you up very well," reflected Mildred. "I speak all languages. The little folk of every age and every country understand me." "You're a great traveller, then?" "I should say so." "You don't seem to carry much baggage about with you. I suppose you belong somewhere, and keep your clothes there. I really should like to know where you came from, if it's all the same to you." "Out of that box, my dove," replied Jumping Jack, having become affable in his turn. "Never!" exclaimed Mildred with a delightful air of incredulity. "I hope I may die," declared Heliogabalus, laying one hand on the left breast of his mainspring. "I don't believe it," said Mildred confidently. "Ho, ho! You are too tall and too wide and too fluffy. I don't mean to hurt your feelings, but you are fluffy, and I just want you to stop that ho-hoing. No, I don't believe it." "You don't you? Behold!" And placing both hands on the floor, Heliogabalus described a circle in the air, and neatly landed himself in the box. He was no sooner in than Mildred clapped down the lid and seated herself upon it victoriously. In the suddenness of her movement she had necessarily neglected to fasten the catch, but that was a detail that could be attended to later. Meanwhile she was mistress of the situation, and could dictate terms. One thing was resolved: Jumping Jack was never to jump again. To-morrow he should be thrown into the Charles at the foot of Mount Vernon Street, in order that the tide might carry him out to sea. What would she not have given if she could have sealed him up with the talismanic seal of Solomon, which held the cruel Marid so securely in his brazen casket? Of course it was not in Mildred's blood to resist the temptation to tease her captive a little. "Now, Mr. Jack, I guess I've got you where you belong. If you're not an old man this very minute, you will be when you get out. You wanted to carry off my Blondella, did you? The idea! I hope you're quite comfortable." "Let me out!" growled Heliogabalus in his deepest bass. "I could not think of it, dear. You are one of those little boys that shouldn't be either seen or heard, and I don't want to speak to you again, for I'm sitting on your head, and your voice goes right through me. So you will please remember not to speak unless you are spoken to." And Mildred broke into the merriest laugh imaginable, recollecting how many times she herself had been extinguished by the same instructions. But Mildred's triumph was premature, for the little man in the box was as strong as a giant in a dime museum, and now that he had fully recovered his breath, he began pushing in a most systematic manner with his head and shoulders, and Mildred, to her great consternation, found herself being slowly lifted up on the lid of the box, do what she might. In a minute or two more she must inevitably fall off, and Jumping Jack would have her. And what mercy could she expect at his hands after her treatment of him? She was lost. Mildred stretched out her arms in despair, gave a shriek, and opened her eyes, which had been all the while as tightly shut as a couple of morning glories at sundown. She was sitting on a rug in the middle of the room. Though the window panes were still flush with memory of the winter sunset, the iridescent lights had faded out in the Japanese crystal at her feet. She was not anywhere near the little imp. There he was over by the fireplace, staring at nothing in his usual senseless fashion. Not a piece of crockery had been broken, not a chair upset, and Blondella, the too fascinating Blondella, had not had a single tress disarranged. Mildred drew a long breath of relief. What had happened? Had she been dreaming? She was unable to answer the question, but as she abstractedly shook out the creases in the folds of her skirt, she remarked to herself that she did not care, on the whole, to have any of her things come to life, certainly not Jumping Jack. Just then the splintering of an icicle on the window ledge outside sent a faint whiteness into her cheek, and caused her to throw a quick, apprehensive glance towards the fireplace. After an instant's hesitation, Mildred unconsciously dragged Blondella by the hair, stole softly from the room, where the spectres of the twilight were beginning to gather rather menacingly, and went downstairs to join the family and relate her strange adventure. The analysis of Miss Wentworth's dream, if it were a dream, for later on she declared it was not, and hurriedly gave Heliogabalus to an unpleasant small boy who lived next door, the analysis of her dream, I repeat, shows strong traces of a moral. Indeed, the residuum is purely of that stringent quality. Heliogabalus must be accepted as the symbol of an ill-considered desire realized. The earnestness with which Miss Wentworth invoked the phantasm, and the misery that came of it, are a common experience. Painfully to attain possession of what we do not want, and then painfully to waste our days in attempting to rid ourselves of it, seems to be a part of our discipline here below. I know a great many excellent persons who are spending the latter moiety of life in the endeavour to get their particular Jumping Jack snugly back into its box again. End of A Christmas Fantasy with a Moral. Recording by Linda Ferguson.